Dorothy Williams stood at Gate B7 in Atlanta's busy airport, holding her worn leather purse close to her chest. At 82 years old, she moved slowly, but with purpose. Her navy blue dress was simple but clean, and she wore comfortable black shoes that had seen many miles. A small silver pin shaped like a cross sat on her jacket collar. Most people walking by didn't notice it, but it meant everything to her. The gate area was crowded with travelers. Some sat in plastic chairs looking at their phones. Others stood, in line, eager to board the plane. Dorothy found an empty chair and sat down carefully. Her knees hurt more these days, and standing for long periods made her tired. She pulled out her boarding pass and read it again, even though she had checked it 5 times already. Seat 12A. A window seat. She smiled a little. She liked looking out at the clouds. The announcement came over the speakers. Now boarding Flight 347 to Chicago. We will begin with first-class passengers and our premium members. Dorothy watched as well-dressed people with expensive luggage walked toward the gate. A man in a dark suit pushed past other passengers rudely. His wife followed behind him, looking embarrassed by his behavior. General boarding for Flight 347 will begin shortly, the gate agent said into her microphone. Dorothy stood up slowly, using her cane for support. The cane was wooden with a simple handle. Her late husband had carved it for her 10 years ago when her arthritis got worse. She missed him every day. When her group was called, Dorothy walked toward the plane. The tunnel leading to the aircraft was long, and her steps echoed softly. She could hear the noise of other passengers behind her, some talking loudly on their phones, others dragging their rolling bags across the floor. The flight attendant at the door smiled at Dorothy as she showed her boarding pass. "Welcome aboard," the young woman said. Her name tag read Lisa Martin. She had blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun and wore the airline's blue uniform. Lisa looked at Dorothy's ticket and pointed down the narrow aisle. Seat 12A is about halfway back on the left side. Dorothy nodded and began walking down the aisle. The plane was filling up quickly. Overhead bins opened and closed as passengers put away their carry-on bags. Dorothy's small bag fit easily under the seat in front of her, so she didn't need to worry about the overhead space. As she moved slowly down the aisle, Dorothy used her cane and held onto the seatbacks for balance. The aisle was narrow, and she had to be careful. Behind her, she could hear someone getting impatient. "Come on, lady. Move it along," a man's voice said loudly. Dorothy recognized it as the rude man from the gate area. His name was Craig Bennett, though Dorothy didn't know that. Craig was a businessman who flew often and always acted like he owned the plane. He wore an expensive watch and carried a leather briefcase that cost more than most people made in a month. Dorothy tried to move faster, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She was doing her best, but Craig's comments made her feel rushed and nervous. Other passengers started looking, and Dorothy felt her cheeks grow warm with embarrassment. Lisa Martin noticed the situation from her position near the front of the plane. She saw Craig Bennett rolling his eyes and making faces. Craig was in first class, seat 2B, and he was one of the airline's frequent flyers. The company always told the flight attendants to keep the premium passengers happy. "Ma'am," Lisa called out to Dorothy, "maybe you'd be more comfortable in a different seat." Lisa's voice was sweet, but there was something underneath it that didn't feel kind. Dorothy stopped walking and turned around. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Lisa walked toward Dorothy, her smile looking forced now. "I was thinking you might like a seat closer to the restroom, for convenience." She gestured toward the back of the plane. "We have some lovely seats available, in the last few rows." Dorothy looked confused. She held up her boarding pass. "But I have seat 12A. I paid for this seat when I bought my ticket online." "Oh, I understand," Lisa said, but her tone suggested she didn't care about Dorothy's confusion. "Sometimes the computer makes mistakes. We just want all our passengers to be comfortable." She looked back at Craig Bennett, who was tapping his foot impatiently. "The seats in the back are actually quieter, less foot traffic." An uncomfortable feeling grew in Dorothy's stomach. She had traveled by plane before, though not often. This had never happened to her. She looked around at the other passengers, hoping someone might say something, but most people were looking at their phones or putting away their bags. A few were watching, but they looked away when Dorothy's eyes met theirs. One young man in seat 15C was paying attention. His name was Alex Rodriguez, and he was flying home to Chicago after visiting his grandmother in Atlanta. Alex was 28 years old and worked as a teacher. He had seen discrimination before, and something about this situation felt wrong to him. But he wasn't sure if he should say something. Maybe the flight attendant really was trying to help the old lady. Dorothy felt tired suddenly. The long day of travel was catching up with her, and she didn't want to cause trouble. She had learned long ago that sometimes it was easier to go along with things, even when they didn't feel right. "I suppose that would be fine," Dorothy said softly. She began walking toward the back of the plane, her cane tapping against the floor with each step. The sound seemed louder now, and she felt like everyone was watching her. Craig Bennett sat down in his first-class seat with satisfaction. "Finally," he muttered to his wife Karen. "I don't know why airlines let just anyone fly these days." Karen. Bennett looked uncomfortable with her husband's comment, but she didn't say anything. She never did. Dorothy found herself in seat 30F, the last row of the plane. The seat was by the window, just like her original seat, but it felt different back here. The bathroom was right next to her, and she could hear the sounds of the plane's engines more loudly. She put her small bag under the seat and sat down carefully. As she looked out the small window, Dorothy's hand touched the pin on her jacket. The silver cross caught a bit of light from the overhead reading lamp. She closed her eyes for a moment and remembered when she first received that pin. It was so long ago, in a place far from here, when she was young and the world was different. Back then, she had saved lives and been called a hero. Today she felt very small and very tired. Dorothy settled into her seat in the back row and tried to make herself comfortable. The airplane was almost full now, and flight attendants were walking up and down the aisles checking that everyone was ready for takeoff. She could hear the sounds of people talking, children crying, and bags being moved around in the overhead bins. From her seat in the last row, Dorothy could see most of the other passengers. She noticed that the man who had been rude to her, Craig Bennett, was now sitting in first class with a drink in his hand. He was talking loudly to his wife, but Dorothy couldn't hear exactly what he was saying. She could tell by his gestures, and the way other passengers looked at him, that he was still complaining about something. Lisa Martin was busy serving drinks to the first-class passengers. She smiled brightly at Craig and asked if he needed anything else. Craig nodded toward the back of the plane where Dorothy was sitting. "I'm just glad we got that situation handled," he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Some people just don't understand how to behave on airplanes." His wife Karen looked embarrassed. "Craig, please keep your voice down," she whispered. But Craig was not finished. He took a sip of his drink and continued talking. "I mean, really, why do airlines let just anyone fly these days?" That old woman was holding up the entire boarding process. She could barely walk down the aisle. A woman sitting across from Craig, in first class, looked uncomfortable. She picked up a magazine and started reading, clearly trying not to listen to Craig's complaints. Other first-class passengers began putting in their headphones or looking out their windows. Lisa Martin felt nervous as she listened to Craig's words. She knew she had made Dorothy move seats, and part of her wondered if she had done the right thing. But Craig was an important customer. He flew with their airline at least twice a month for business, and the company always told flight attendants to take care of their frequent flyers. Back in economy class, Alex Rodriguez was settling into his seat when he heard Craig's voice carrying from first class. Alex was a good person who believed in treating everyone fairly. He had grown up in a family that taught him to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. His grandmother had told him stories about discrimination when she was young, and he recognized what he was seeing. Alex turned around to look at Dorothy. She was sitting quietly in the last row, looking out the window. She seemed small and alone back there. Alex felt angry that she had been treated unfairly, but he wasn't sure what to do about it. He had never confronted a flight attendant before, and he didn't want to cause trouble on the plane. Near the middle of the plane, an older white man named Frank Miller was reading a newspaper. Frank was 74 years old and had served in the Vietnam War. He had gray hair and wore a simple button-down shirt with khaki pants. Frank had been watching what happened when Dorothy boarded the plane, and he didn't like what he saw. Frank had seen discrimination before, both in the military and in civilian life. He knew what it looked like, and he was pretty sure that's what had happened to Dorothy. The way the flight attendant had moved her to the back of the plane without any real reason made Frank angry. He believed that all people should be treated with respect, especially elderly people who deserved courtesy and kindness. Craig Bennett was still talking loudly in first class. "I pay good money for these flights," he said to anyone who would listen. "I shouldn't have to deal with people who slow everything down. There should be separate flights for people like that." His wife Karen finally spoke up. "Craig, that's enough. You're being rude." "I'm being practical," Craig replied. "Some people just don't belong in the same spaces as others. It's not personal, it's just common sense." A businessman sitting nearby finally had enough. "Excuse me," he said to Craig, "but you're making a lot of people uncomfortable with your comments." Craig turned to face the man. "I'm sorry if the truth makes you uncomfortable, but someone needs to say what everyone is thinking." "I don't think everyone is thinking what you're thinking," the businessman replied calmly. Lisa Martin was serving drinks in the economy section when she noticed that people were starting to whisper among themselves. Some passengers were looking toward the front of the plane where Craig was sitting, while others were looking back at Dorothy. Lisa began to feel worried that the situation was getting out of control. She decided to check on Dorothy to make sure everything was okay. Lisa walked to the back of the plane with a smile on her face, trying to look friendly and professional. "How are you doing back here, ma'am?" Lisa asked Dorothy. "Is your seat comfortable?" Dorothy looked up at Lisa with tired eyes. "It's fine, thank you." Good, Lisa said, but she seemed nervous. "I just want to make sure there are no problems with your boarding pass or anything like that. Sometimes the computer system makes errors and we have to fix them." Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out her boarding pass again. She handed it to Lisa without saying anything. The boarding pass clearly showed seat 12A, not seat 30F where Dorothy was now sitting. Lisa looked at the boarding pass and felt a moment of panic. She realized that Dorothy's original seat assignment was correct, and she had moved Dorothy without any valid reason. But now she felt trapped. She couldn't admit her mistake in front of all these passengers, and she couldn't deal with Craig Bennett becoming angry again. "Well," Lisa said slowly, "there seems to be some confusion here. Let me check with the captain about this seating issue." Alex Rodriguez had been watching this conversation from his seat. He couldn't hear everything that was being said, but he could see that Dorothy looked upset and confused. The flight attendant seemed to be questioning Dorothy's right to be on the plane, and Alex felt his anger growing. Finally, Alex couldn't stay quiet anymore. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up in the aisle. His voice was clear and loud enough for many passengers to hear. "Excuse me," Alex called out to Lisa Martin. "Why are you checking this lady's boarding pass again? She already showed it to you when she got on the plane." The airplane became quieter as passengers turned to listen. Lisa felt her face getting red. She wasn't used to being questioned by passengers, especially not in front of everyone. "Sir, please sit down," Lisa said to Alex. "This is between me and this passenger." "No, I don't think it is," Alex replied firmly. "I saw what happened when she boarded. You made her move from her assigned seat to the back of the plane for no good reason. That's not right." Other passengers were now paying attention to what was happening. Some were nodding in agreement with Alex while others looked uncomfortable with the confrontation. Frank Miller closed his newspaper and turned around to see what was going on. When he saw Dorothy sitting alone in the back row and heard Alex defending her, Frank felt proud of the young man for speaking up. Frank had remained silent too many times in his life when he should have spoken up for what was right. Dorothy felt embarrassed that she was causing such a disturbance. She had spent her whole life trying not to make trouble for anyone. But deep inside, she also felt grateful that someone was finally standing up for her. The airplane felt tense as Alex Rodriguez stood in the aisle facing Lisa Martin. Other passengers were watching the situation, and many seemed uncomfortable with what they were seeing. Some people whispered to each other, while others pretended to read magazines or look out their windows. Lisa Martin felt trapped. She knew that Alex was right about what had happened, but she couldn't admit her mistake in front of everyone. Her hands shook slightly as she held Dorothy's boarding pass. "Sir, I need you to sit down immediately," Lisa said to Alex. Her voice was louder now and she was trying to sound authoritative. "You're interfering with airline business." "I'm not interfering with anything," Alex replied calmly. "I'm asking why an elderly woman was forced to move from her assigned seat when she did nothing wrong." Frank Miller had been listening to everything from his seat in row 8. He couldn't stay quiet anymore. Frank stood up slowly, his old joints creaking a bit. He had gray hair and kind eyes, and when he spoke his voice was steady and strong. "The young man is right," Frank said loud enough for most of the plane to hear. "I saw what happened too. That lady was moved from her seat for no good reason." More passengers started turning around to look at what was happening. A woman in row 15 put down her book. A businessman stopped typing on his laptop. Even some of the first-class passengers were craning their necks to see what the commotion was about. Craig Bennett heard the voices from economy class and turned around in his first-class seat. He was annoyed that people were still talking about the situation. "What's all the noise back there?" he called out loudly. "We're talking about how you treated that elderly woman," Alex called back to Craig, "and how wrong it was." Craig's face turned red with anger. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up even though passengers weren't supposed to be standing while the plane was preparing for takeoff. "Listen, kid," Craig said angrily. "Some people need to learn their place. That old woman was slowing everyone down and she needed to be moved. It's not my fault if she can't keep up with normal people." The airplane became very quiet. Even the flight attendants stopped what they were doing to listen. Craig's words hung in the air like a bad smell, and many passengers looked shocked by what he had said. Karen Bennett pulled on her husband's sleeve. "Craig, sit down right now," she whispered urgently. "You're making this worse." But Craig was too angry to listen. "I fly this airline all the time and I pay good money for first class. I shouldn't have to put up with delays because some people don't belong here." Dorothy sat in the back row listening to all of this. She felt small and hurt by Craig's cruel words. She had lived through discrimination before many years ago, but it still hurt just as much now as it did then. Her hand touched the small silver pin on her jacket, and she thought about all the things she had seen and done in her long life. Alex Rodriguez felt his anger growing as he listened to Craig's words. "What do you mean some people don't belong here?" Alex asked loudly. "She bought a ticket just like everyone else. She has every right to be on this plane." "Look," Craig said, walking toward the economy section. "I'm just saying what everyone is thinking. Some people should stick to buses or trains. Flying is for people who can afford it and know how to behave properly." Frank Miller had heard enough. He stepped into the aisle and faced Craig Bennett. Even though Frank was older, he was still tall and had the bearing of someone who had served in the military. "Son," Frank said to Craig, his voice calm but firm, "you need to stop talking right now. You're embarrassing yourself and everyone around you." "Don't call me son, old man," Craig replied rudely. "This isn't your business." "It became my business when you started talking about people not belonging here," Frank said. "I fought in a war to protect everyone's right to be treated fairly, including that lady in the back row." More passengers were standing up now to see what was happening. A young mother in row 12 was holding her baby and looking worried. A college student was recording the argument on his phone. The tension in the airplane was growing stronger by the minute. Lisa Martin realized that the situation was completely out of control. She had never dealt with anything like this before, and she didn't know what to do. She looked toward the front of the plane where the other flight attendants were standing, but they seemed just as confused as she was. Captain Robert Hayes was in the cockpit finishing his pre-flight preparations when he heard voices getting louder in the cabin. He had been flying for 15 years and had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this sounded different. He could hear multiple people arguing, and it seemed to be getting worse instead of better. Captain Hayes was a good pilot and a fair man. He believed that everyone deserved to be treated with respect on his airplane. He had served briefly in the military before becoming a pilot, and he understood the importance of standing up for what was right. The captain unbuckled his harness and left the cockpit. As he walked into the main cabin, he could see passengers standing in the aisles and others craning their necks to watch the argument. Craig Bennett was still talking loudly, while Alex Rodriguez and Frank Miller were facing him. "What's going on here?" Captain Hayes asked in a calm but authoritative voice. He was wearing his captain's uniform with gold stripes on his sleeves, and when he spoke, people listened. Lisa Martin hurried over to the captain. "Captain Hayes, we have a small disagreement about seating arrangements," she said nervously. "I've been trying to resolve it." "It's not small and it's not about seating," Alex said to the captain. "This flight attendant moved an elderly woman from her assigned seat for no reason, and that man," Alex pointed to Craig, "has been saying terrible things about her." Captain Hayes looked around the cabin. He could see the tension on people's faces. Then his eyes found Dorothy, sitting alone in the very back row. She looked small and sad, and something about her reminded him of his own grandmother. The captain walked slowly toward the back of the plane. As he got closer to Dorothy, he noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. On her jacket collar was a small silver pin. It was shaped like a cross, but there were words around it that Captain Hayes recognized. It was a military service pin, specifically one given to medical personnel who had served in combat zones. Captain Hayes had seen pins like that before. His own grandfather had received one during World War II, and the captain knew they were only given to people who had risked their lives to save others. The captain felt his heart rate increase as he realized what Dorothy's pin meant. He approached Dorothy's seat and knelt down beside her so they could talk at eye level. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I'm Captain Hayes. I couldn't help but notice your service pin. Were you in the military?" Dorothy looked up at the captain with surprised eyes. Most people never noticed her pin or understood what it meant. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I was a nurse in Korea, a long time ago." Captain Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. Korea. That meant Dorothy had served during one of the most difficult wars in American history, treating wounded soldiers under horrible conditions. And if she was wearing a combat medical pin, it meant she had been in real danger while saving lives. Captain Hayes knelt beside Dorothy's seat, looking at her with new respect. The small silver pin on her jacket meant more than most people could imagine. He had studied military history, and he knew that nurses who served in Korea had faced terrible dangers while saving countless lives. "Ma'am, could you tell me more about your service?" Captain Hayes asked gently. His voice was quiet and respectful, very different from the loud arguing that had been happening moments before. Dorothy looked, surprised that anyone wanted to hear about her time in the war. Most people never asked about it, and she rarely talked about those difficult years. "I served from 1951 to 1953, she said softly. "I was stationed at a field hospital near the front lines." The captain's eyes widened. Field hospitals in Korea were incredibly dangerous places. Nurses there worked under constant threat of enemy attack while treating severely wounded soldiers. Many medical personnel had been killed or wounded while trying to save others. "What was your rank?" Captain Hayes asked. "I was a lieutenant," Dorothy replied. "I was one of only 12 black nurses allowed to serve in combat zones during the entire war. We worked 18-hour days, sometimes longer when the fighting was heavy." Captain Hayes felt his heart pounding. He was talking to a true war hero, someone who had risked everything to save American soldiers. The fact that she had faced discrimination, even while serving her country, made her sacrifice even more meaningful. Dorothy continued talking, her voice growing stronger as she remembered. "We treated everyone who came through our doors. White soldiers, black soldiers, soldiers from other countries fighting with us. When someone was bleeding and dying, skin color didn't matter. We just tried to save as many as we could." The captain listened carefully to every word. He thought about his own grandfather, who had been a soldier in World War II. His grandfather had told him stories about brave nurses who had saved his life and the lives of his friends. Captain Hayes realized he was sitting next to someone just like those heroes from his grandfather's stories. "How many soldiers do you think you helped save?" Captain Hayes asked. Dorothy thought for a moment. "I never counted," she said. "Hundreds, maybe thousands. We were too busy to keep track. Every day brought new wounded soldiers, and we worked until we couldn't stand up anymore. Then we slept for a few hours and started again." By now, other passengers had noticed that the captain was talking quietly with Dorothy in the back row. The arguing had stopped, and people were curious about what was happening. Alex Rodriguez and Frank Miller moved closer to listen. Even some of the first-class passengers were stretching to hear the conversation. Captain Hayes stood up slowly. He looked around the cabin at all the passengers who were watching. Then he looked back at Dorothy, and his mind was made up. What had happened to this woman was wrong, and he was going to fix it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Hayes said in a clear, strong voice that carried throughout the entire airplane, "I need everyone's attention for a moment." The cabin became completely quiet. Even Craig Bennett stopped talking and turned to listen to the captain. "We have someone very special on our flight today," Captain Hayes continued. "The lady sitting in seat 30F is Mrs. Dorothy Williams. She is a Korean War veteran who served as a combat nurse from 1951 to 1953. Some passengers began to murmur with surprise and interest. Frank Miller smiled because he knew that Captain Hayes understood the significance of Dorothy's service. Captain Hayes wasn't finished. Mrs. Williams risked her life every single day to save wounded American soldiers. She worked under enemy fire, during bombing attacks, and in conditions that most of us cannot imagine. She was one of only 12 black nurses allowed to serve in combat zones during the entire Korean War. The airplane was so quiet now that people could hear the sounds of the engines and the air conditioning system. Everyone was listening carefully to the captain's words. "Mrs. Williams saved hundreds, possibly thousands of American lives during her service," Captain Hayes said. "She came home to a country that didn't always appreciate her sacrifice, but she never complained. She served with honor and dignity." Dorothy felt tears forming in her eyes. No one had ever talked about her service this way before. When she came home from Korea, there were no parades or ceremonies for nurses like her. She had simply returned to civilian life and tried to forget the terrible things she had seen. Captain Hayes looked directly at Craig Bennett, who was sitting in first class looking uncomfortable. "I have learned that Mrs. Williams was asked to move from her assigned seat during boarding. This happened because some passengers were impatient with her slow walking pace." Craig's face turned red, and he looked down at his hands. His wife Karen moved away from him slightly, clearly embarrassed by her husband's behavior. "Let me be very clear about something," Captain Hayes said, his voice growing stronger. "Mrs. Williams has more right to be on this airplane than anyone else here. She fought for the freedom that allows us all to travel safely today. She deserves our respect, our gratitude, and our best treatment." Alex Rodriguez started clapping. Frank Miller joined him immediately. Soon, other passengers throughout the airplane were applauding. The sound grew louder and louder until almost everyone was clapping for Dorothy. Dorothy wiped tears from her eyes. She had never experienced anything like this before. For so many years, her service had been forgotten or ignored. Now, suddenly, a whole plane full of strangers was honoring her. Captain Hayes raised his hand to quiet the applause. "Mrs. Williams, I want to personally apologize for how you were treated today. It was wrong, and it will not stand on my aircraft." He looked at Lisa Martin, who was standing nearby looking very ashamed. "Flight Attendant Martin, please move Mrs. Williams to seat 2A in first class immediately, and upgrade her ticket to first class at no charge." Lisa Martin nodded quickly. "Yes, Captain," she said quietly. But Captain Hayes wasn't done yet. He walked over to Dorothy and did something that surprised everyone on the plane. The captain removed his cap, which was part of his official uniform. Then he stood at attention and gave Dorothy a perfect military salute. "Thank you for your service, Lieutenant Williams," Captain Hayes said formally. Dorothy couldn't hold back her tears anymore. She cried not from sadness, but from joy and relief. After more than 70 years, someone finally understood what she had done and why it mattered. The entire airplane erupted in applause again, even louder than before. Passengers were standing up and cheering. Some people were crying along with Dorothy. Even the other flight attendants were clapping and wiping their eyes. Frank Miller walked over to Dorothy and shook her hand. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. From one veteran to another. Alex Rodriguez was smiling widely as he watched the scene. He felt proud that he had spoken up for Dorothy even though he had been scared to do it at first. Captain Hayes helped Dorothy gather her things and personally escorted her to first class. As they walked down the aisle together, passengers reached out to shake her hand and thank her for her service. Dorothy felt like she was walking on air. Craig Bennett sat in his first-class seat feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. He realized that he had been cruel to a genuine American hero. His wife, Karen, wouldn't even look at him, and he knew he had embarrassed himself in front of everyone. Dorothy settled into seat 2A in first class, still amazed by what had just happened. The leather seat was much more comfortable than the one in the back row, and she had plenty of room to stretch her legs. A flight attendant brought her a warm blanket and a cup of tea without her even asking for them. Captain Hayes made sure Dorothy was comfortable before returning to the cockpit to prepare for takeoff. As he walked past Craig Bennett's seat, he stopped and looked down at the businessman who had caused all the trouble. "Mr. Bennett," Captain Hayes said quietly, "I hope you learned something today about treating people with respect." Craig couldn't look the captain in the eyes. He nodded slightly but didn't say anything. His wife Karen was reading a magazine and pretending her husband didn't exist. Craig realized that his behavior had not only hurt Dorothy, but had also embarrassed his wife and made him look foolish in front of everyone. As the airplane prepared for takeoff, Dorothy looked out her window at the city of Atlanta growing smaller below. She thought about all the years that had passed since she came home from Korea. She had worked as a nurse in civilian hospitals for many years, always helping people but never talking about her military service. Most people didn't want to hear about the war, and Dorothy had learned to keep her memories to herself. During the flight, something wonderful happened. Passengers kept coming up to Dorothy's seat to talk with her and thank her for her service. A young mother brought her baby over to meet Dorothy. An older gentleman showed her a picture of his father who had served in Korea around the same time Dorothy was there. Alex Rodriguez came to first class to check on Dorothy. "Mrs. Williams," he said, "I want you to know how proud I am that I spoke up for you today. My grandmother always taught me to stand up for what's right." Dorothy smiled at Alex. "Thank you, young man. It means more to me than you know. Your grandmother raised you well." Frank Miller also visited Dorothy during the flight. He sat in the empty seat next to her and they talked about their military experiences. Frank had served in Vietnam and Dorothy had many friends who had served there too. They shared stories about military life and the challenges of coming home from war. "You know," Frank said to Dorothy, "I served in Vietnam and people weren't always kind to us when we came home. But what you went through was probably even harder. You had to deal with discrimination because of your race and because you were a woman, on top of everything else." Dorothy nodded. "It was difficult sometimes," she admitted. "But I always believed that serving my country was the right thing to do, no matter how some people treated me." Lisa Martin approached Dorothy's seat nervously. The flight attendant looked embarrassed and sorry for what she had done earlier. "Mrs. Williams," Lisa said quietly, "I owe you a sincere apology. I was wrong to move you from your seat, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you." Dorothy looked at Lisa with kind eyes. She had learned long ago that holding on to anger only hurt herself. "I accept your apology," Dorothy said. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them." Lisa felt relieved, but still guilty. "Is there anything I can do to make this right?" she asked. "Just treat everyone with kindness and respect from now on," Dorothy replied. "That's all any of us can do." Captain Hayes visited Dorothy during the flight to show her something special. He pulled out his phone and showed her a picture of an elderly man in a military uniform. "This is my grandfather," he said. "He served in World War II and was wounded in France. A nurse saved his life in a field hospital just like the work you did in Korea." Dorothy studied the picture carefully. "He looks like a good man," she said. "He was," Captain Hayes replied. "He used to tell me stories about the brave nurses who took care of wounded soldiers. He always said they were the real heroes of the war. When I saw your service pin today, I thought about him and all the lives you must have saved." The captain paused for a moment. "My grandfather came home and lived to be 89 years old because someone like you saved his life." He got married, had children, and got to meet his grandchildren. All of that happened because a nurse cared enough to save him. Dorothy felt tears in her eyes again. "I'm glad your grandfather made it home safely," she said. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, Captain Hayes made another announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare to land in Chicago, I want to remind everyone about our special passenger, Mrs. Dorothy Williams. When we arrive at the gate, please remain seated until Mrs. Williams has had a chance to exit the aircraft. First, it's a small way we can show our continued respect for her service." When the plane landed and came to a stop at the gate, something unexpected was waiting for Dorothy. Captain Hayes had radioed ahead to the airport and told them about Dorothy's story. Airport workers and several local veterans were waiting at the gate with flowers and small American flags. As Dorothy walked off the plane with Captain Hayes beside her, the small crowd at the gate began applauding. A representative from the airport gave her a bouquet of flowers and thanked her for her service. 3 elderly men who were Korean War veterans saluted her as she passed by. News reporters had heard about the story and were there to interview Dorothy. She felt overwhelmed by all the attention, but answered their questions gracefully. The story was broadcast on local television that evening and picked up by national news the next day. Over the following weeks, Dorothy received hundreds of letters from people all over the country thanking her for her service. Veterans organizations invited her to speak at their events. A local school asked her to talk to students about the Korean War and her experiences as a military nurse. Lisa Martin kept her promise to Dorothy. She took sensitivity training and began volunteering at a veterans hospital in her free time. She learned about the sacrifices that military personnel had made and became a better person because of what Dorothy had taught her. Craig Bennett also changed after that flight. He was so ashamed of his behavior that he began volunteering with organizations that helped elderly veterans. He never forgot the lesson he learned about treating all people with respect and dignity. Alex Rodriguez stayed in touch with Dorothy and visited her whenever he was in Chicago. She became like a grandmother to him, and he made sure she was never lonely or forgotten. Frank Miller and Dorothy became close friends. They met for coffee regularly and shared stories about their lives and their military service. Frank helped Dorothy connect with other Korean War veterans in the Chicago area. Captain Hayes arranged for Dorothy to visit the cockpit of airplanes whenever she flew, and airline employees always made sure she was treated with special care and respect. Most importantly, Dorothy finally received the recognition she had deserved for so many years. The little silver pin on her jacket was no longer overlooked. People knew what it meant, and they honored the woman who wore it with such quiet dignity. Dorothy Williams had spent most of her life being invisible, but on Flight 347, she became a hero once again. Her story reminded everyone that real heroes are often the quiet, humble people who serve others without asking for anything in return.